We are coming to the end of the course, and I suggest marking our closure with a brief inroad outside the range of compositions selected for discussion. I'm going to briefly address now Pauline epistles. Paul features prominently in the second part of Acts, and it is illuminating to compare the picture presented by our author with that provided by the letters of Paul himself. Scholars have outlined both overlaps and differences between the two sets of evidence, and various explanations for those differences were offered. Among other topics, the question of historical reliability has been repeatedly raised. Whom should we trust more? Paul expressing his own views, or the author of Acts propagating his religious agenda? But did not Paul also have an agenda? We are not going to solve the riddle now, but remember that our interest has been mostly in beliefs and perceptions rather than the history of nascent Christianity. In this sense, the stances of both Paul and the author of Acts are equally important, as it is exactly in the case of differences that they may bear witness to a variety of outlooks within the Jesus movement. What can be gleaned from a comparison between Acts and Paul's own writings? A detailed discussion of this topic should wait for a sequel to this course, so let me limit myself here to few remarks on similarities and dissimilarities, which beg for interpretation. In his letters addressed to various diaspora communities, mostly non-Jewish, Paul does not propagate a close-knit quasi-Qumranic communal structure described at the beginning of Acts. The author of Acts does not mention this element in his description of Paul's travels throughout the Greco-Roman diaspora either. This motif, thus, does not seem to have been a common rhetorical device reused by various authors, but rather reflects a historical peculiarity of the nascent Jerusalem community. Unlike it, Acts and Paul's letters do share the centrality of the gift of the Holy Spirit. In his own writings, Paul sometimes tried to convince his addressees to switch the emphasis from the ecstatic elements of the anointment of the Spirit to other expressions of the Spirit, and generally to focus more on the crucifixion, resurrection motif. The apostle may then bear witness to certain disillusionment with that ecstatic component, and to the need to properly organize the conduct of the people and communities in light of the postponement of the end. In Paul's writings, there is a definite overlap with ideas expressed in the programmatic speeches in Acts, but it deserves notice that in Acts, for example in chapter 2, the emphasis is much more on resurrection than on Jesus' crucifixion and suffering. We may be dealing here with two different religious temperaments. Alternatively, Paul may bear witness to a meaningful change of focus from the hope for the Messiah's close future return to the inner metamorphosis engendered in the believer by Jesus' past death. This dichotomy would have a long history in later Christianity. Introduction of the Gentiles is portrayed in Acts as a harmonious development, guided by revelatory events and with a full agreement between the Jerusalem apostles and Paul. In Paul's letters, the conflict between the two parties is highlighted. It stands to reason that we hear here echoes of various attitudes existing side by side during the early history of the movement. And lastly, whereas in Paul's own writings, for example in the Epistle to the Romans, the mission to the Jews is presented as a failure, even if a temporary one, in Acts it's a story of great success, though not without difficulties. To repeat what has already been said, the author of Acts must have been aware of the feeling that the success was much greater among the Gentiles than among the Jews, but he preferred to uphold the Jewish center of the movement. Leaving the facts and realities aside, we may note a clear difference in agenda. The author of Acts was trying to retain the faithfulness to the biblical model of redemption, hence spelling out the mission to the Gentiles without losing the Jewish center. This is what allowed him to argue that the final redemption was near. With Paul, in his later epistles, we are dealing with a long historical perspective, so that distant glorious future is not endangered by current Jewish fiasco. The tension between the two tendencies or perceptions would be resolved in the history of the movement in Paul's favor in the 2nd century. The postponement of the end would by then become a well-recognized reality, and Christianity, already a religious movement distinctly separate from Judaism with mostly non-Jewish membership, would then feel more affinity with Paul's polemical stance. During the 1st century, however, the position of Acts might have still had an upper hand.